Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I have been stunned during my 11 years now in Orlando to meet people from South Florida who say they couldn't live in Orlando. Why not? It's too cold. It's too cold. They say in the winter it gets cold. And it is true that occasionally it gets below 60. Occasionally, we might even have a frost warning at night, potentially, and if you're out at 3 a.m., you might need a jacket. But I mean, honestly, is this really too cold? Now, maybe I should counter, though, that if you're feeling too old and too cold, as it is often elderly that are complaining, maybe you should take a page out of the Tanakh. Feeling too cold? Hire a young person to cuddle with you. After all, that is how the Haftarah begins. How many people read that first section and just sort of skimmed down to the next part, feeling vaguely uncomfortable that Abishag was just sort of hanging out as a living bed warmer for King David? It felt a little inappropriate, perhaps. That suggestion, if I were actually to, for example, begin a rental program for young people, for old people, how quickly do you think I would be the subject of investigations and protests? Almost immediately. And yet, within the text itself, it is explicit that there was nothing explicit going on, that there was no intimacy between Abishag and David. And we can be absolutely sure of that, not just because the text tells us so, but because the text doesn't tell us that Bathsheba went and beat up her husband, as she would have had he begun to have other dalliances in ways that she disapproved of. I don't think she is somebody that would have taken that very lightly. So why are we so hyper-aware and sensitive on this topic in a way that would shock our ancestors? How is it that we see a man and a woman and immediately imagine interactions that are between them must be of a sexual nature? When did this almost obsession kick in? Well, actually, sociology has some pretty good answers for that, and it's mostly around the middle of the 20th century. Well, there was a little bit going on during Victorian and Edwardian period where people began to define the gender roles in very explicit terms as a way of signaling status, because you were able to keep a woman, and that was a sign of you having arrived at a certain wealth level within that time period. But we didn't really see the full saturation of these gender roles until mostly after World War II. And there are a number of reasons of why it kicked in at that particular point. One was because after World War II, we were no longer fighting the fascists, we were now fighting... Come on, some of you people were living at that point. I wasn't, and I know the answer. The communists, right? We were fighting the communists. And what do we know about the communists? The communists want to erase differences. They are godless heathens that wish to create an asexual state where everybody walks around wearing gray overalls and little communist caps and work in factories, and you can't tell the difference between men and women. And therefore, for the good of American democracy, boys must wear blue and girls must wear pink. I'm not joking. It sounds exaggerated, but indeed you can trace much of the conversation regarding the hyper-focus on gender roles and gender attire to this time period, and much of it is very much laden with anti-communist rhetoric. But that was not the only thing that was feeding into this. At the counterculture, there was this idea, of course, that love should be free, that with the burgeoning opportunities for birth control and the burgeoning freedoms that more women were being able to enjoy, that intimacy, free love, should be the norm. That we shouldn't have so many hang-ups about who we are sleeping with. It should just be casual, and with anyone, it's all okay. Well, it turns out that if you treat intimacy as a completely casual encounter, as something which has no strings attached to it, that you're deceiving yourself and your partner. Physical intimacy is programmed into us from a biological level to carry with it certain emotional commitments and obligations and attachments. And when we ignore those, we cheapen our sense of self and our sense of the other. When we treat another person as though they are merely an instrument there for our sexual gratification, and that I owe them nothing because we both enjoyed it and that's all that was required, I am actually objectifying them, even in the name of free love. I am treating them merely as a vehicle for pleasure, rather than as a full human being with whom I have shared a deep and physical intimacy, which should only be reflective of emotional connection. So from both the anti-communists as well as from those preaching free love and flower power, we had an objectification. And it doesn't end there. We also had, during the same time period, in the middle of the 20th century, the erosion of many of our standard institutions of authority and respect. Whether it be in the church, whether it be in the government, whether it be in our social communities, people were becoming more and more suspicious, often rightly so, of the traditional modes of authority within the community. Many were being exposed as being corrupt, many were being exposed as being hypocritical, which they were. However, those who saw that there was a danger if we tore down every institution sometimes made the decision to defend institutions that were truly indefensible and to retreat into some nostalgia of the good old days when authoritarianism was benign and everybody knew their place and everyone could be expected to know what was expected of them and to do it without question. And so, in a strange and perverse form of recreating the past in order to create a future, many of these organizations, some religious, some more cultural, began to project very clear and delineated gender roles. Indeed, if you read the literature of many of the evangelicals of this time period, you will see that it is focused in an inordinate amount on how to make sure boys are boys and girls are girls and husbands are husbands and wives are wives and everybody knows their place, which happens to be under the authoritarian rule of the man, because that was a model for the authoritarian rule of the organization or community structure that they were trying to buttress. By creating an authoritarian hierarchy of people within their families and society, you were indoctrinating people to be comfortable with authoritarianism within their community institutions, which is what the community institution leaders wanted. And finally, everything has a price tag. You see, the marketing buffons after World War II noticed something. If I sell you a basketball, and you have a boy and then you later have a girl, you only need the one basketball. It's bright, it's orange, it's easy, it's the same for both of them. On the other hand, if I put a picture of a boy's comic book character on that basketball, and then your daughter becomes interested in basketball, well, she can't play with that basketball, because that basketball is a boy's basketball. It has a boy's cartoon character on it. She needs to get the girl's basketball, which has the girl cartoon character on it, because otherwise, well, you don't really want your girl playing with boy toys, do you? And you don't really want your boy playing with girl toys, do you? There's something a little suspicious about that. This was a deliberate ploy, an advertising ploy, and it's why to this day, when you go to Amazon and you look for a gift for a child, it will immediately ask you, is it a boy or a girl? As though Legos are gendered, as though a baseball bat is gendered. But that is the first question it'll ask you along with their age. And it'll say, show me girl toys, show me boy toys. As if most toys weren't all within the same group. However, this is a synagogue, so rather than only talking about sociology, we have to ask within Judaism, is there any validity to this? Does Judaism then completely ignore all gender distinctions and have no concept of gender roles? Of course not. Judaism recognizes the biological difference between boys and girls. We couldn't make new children if we didn't recognize that distinction. We recognize that men sire, to use the verb, and that women bear children. We recognize that boys get circumcised and girls don't. And that's about it when it comes to biological differences. After all, both of them have issues from the genitalia that can be issues of ritual purity, but they both have their own comparable forms. But apart from that, biological distinctions in the Torah are lacking. Now, there are cultural distinctions. After all, the Torah tells us that women cannot be witnesses, that women are not valid as witnesses, and the rabbis tell us that that women are not obligated to the same number of mitzvot as the men were in their day. Aha, we say, gender distinction right here. Well, not exactly. These were economic distinctions that were present within the societies in which the Torah was given and lived for much of the last 2,000 years. If you are living in a society where 99% of personal wealth is invested in the dirt, in land, because most people are farmers. This is the means of production. Sorry, not to sound communist, but it is the literal means of production. Then it is only going to be inevitable that if you say that means of production, that land is transmitted father to son, as a clan inheritance, the tribes that are mentioned up there behind me, then those people, those men, are going to be more economically powerful than the people that are not men. We call them women. And if the men are more powerful economically simply because of the path of inheritance which was necessary to maintain the balance between the tribes in order that there be equity within the overall nation, then we also shouldn't be too surprised that the Torah and the rabbis recognized that women were at a disadvantageous position and therefore should be let off the hook or not expected to have to do the same amount of work. How can we expect a woman to be beholden to all of the same mitzvot that are linked to time and place when we know that she is beholden to her male relative, whether it be a father, brother, or husband, who controls literally the food she eats and may make contrary demands upon her? What do you mean you're going to synagogue? I need you to do X out in the back field. What is she to do? Is she to go to the synagogue, or is she to placate the person who controls the food that she eats? In an act of compassion, our tradition said, she placates the person who has control of food, because to do otherwise would have been to put her in an impossible position. Likewise, in tradition, when women were not allowed to serve as witnesses, it wasn't because they were considered incompetent. It was because they were considered beholden to another powerful individual. How can you expect her to give honest and fair testimony if we know that behind the scenes her husband may be, or father or brother may be presenting undue pressure, not just to convince her, but to actually coerce her by saying, you give testimony as I say, or else, well, there will be repercussions. And so, women were not allowed to give testimony lest they be forced into a position where they would have to perjure themselves under someone else's coercive influence. Does that mean those conditions remain? Well, all of you are here in a conservative synagogue, so I think that means that you're probably on the same page with me, which has recognized that over the last 100 years, the role of women within the economic world has changed, and as such, we have been allowed to say, good, women are no longer beholden to an economic structure which prejudices the rights of men over their rights. That means you all now have the same responsibilities and obligations as the men. Right? You're not gaining freedom, you're gaining responsibilities, but don't worry, that is the ultimate reward in Judaism. Right? Every major milestone in life is a gaining of responsibility. That's how we show honor in Judaism. The more responsibility, the more we respect you, the more we honor you. And you now all have equal responsibilities because the economic system has been roughly equalized in the external world. An economic system, again, I will remind you, that was not created by Torah, but merely Torah had to work within the boundaries of what it found. So what does that mean? Torah does not proclaim and defend any of these cultural and social distinctions. The rabbis over the centuries made many amendments as much as they could within the economics of their day, creating the institution of the ketubah, the protection for a woman who would be divorced and be left with nothing, or would be widowed and left with nothing. the creation of Beit Din, the courts that could hear a woman's plea to force the husband to divorce her in order to pry some of that power free from his hand, and many other instruments which have been used over the last 2,000 years to defend the rights of women, we can see that Judaism is not trying to preserve traditional gender roles. The Torah doesn't say that men hunt and women cook. The rabbis don't say that men wear blue and girls wear pink. The rabbis and the Torah agree. We are all the children of God. We are all children of the Torah, and though we may individually have our own tendencies and predilections, no one individually should be forced into a stereotype. No one individually should be told they must accommodate despite their own personal desires. If she wants to play with blocks, if he wants to play with dolls, the Torah does not say this is wrong. If she wants to become an engineer and he wants to become a fashion designer, the rabbis don't say this is wrong. But what harm is there? Why not conform to these social roles? Perhaps it will keep the communists away, along with garlic and a horseshoe over the door. Perhaps this will buttress our failing institutions if only men were men and girls were girls, and notice the particular phrasing that usually takes. We drive not only those people away from communities that refuse to allow them to be themselves, but we impoverish ourselves. How much talent, how much joy, how much strength have communities suffered because they have told somebody who had blue dreams or pink dreams that their dreams were the wrong color for them, that they were not allowed to pursue them because to do so would be to challenge the established authority. This isn't about making all engineers girls or all fashion designers boys. This isn't about trying to create a fully gender blind society, but it is seeing the individual first and foremost and allowing them to ultimately be themselves. This is what God has asked us to do, to simply live, to be within the Torah, to be within the world. And sometimes society can get a little caught up in bad ideas. This is something Judaism has noticed, and Judaism continues to point out, I don't think so, and I think we'd all be worse off if we went down that road. Shabbat Shalom.